Steve Bruere, let's talk about you and me and People's Company and basketball and the way people work these days. You good with that?
Yeah, I'm excited.
So I think it's worth mentioning how we met. We met in the Dominican Republic, which is where all great couples start, right?
It's an odd story, but
it is.
The journey continues.
It was so I was brought down to give a talk in the Dominican, and you were at the dinner the first night I was there, and there were probably like 8 or 10 sort of VIP types. And I remember
I don't know why I was there, by the way.
Well, I remember being impressed because you had a certain quiet confidence that not everyone at that table had, if you will recall. And I always appreciate that because I'm from a town of 700 in Kansas, and I've thought a lot about confidence and the way people move through the world. And I think you and I would probably agree on this, that true confidence is usually reserved. Like most of the time, the most confident people don't talk about themselves a ton, and vice versa. Like people who are a hollow shell talk about themselves constantly. And I think that is reflected in us bonding even on that weekend and in the work that we've done together in the last few months. How do you see your approach in the way you present yourself to the world?
Yeah, that's a deep opening thought. But no, I guess, I'm a farm kid and grew up in a small town, and it's just built into you to be humble and appreciate hard work and not be real flamboyant. And so I'm just not naturally flamboyant anyhow. I, in fact, lack a lot of confidence, frankly. But when you get me going on things I care about and I'm interested in, and maybe at that dinner, even after a couple glasses of wine, the confidence starts to exude, right? So, but yeah, generally, there's people that walk into a room and they can own the room. I hate doing stuff like this, for instance, or public speaking. I just generally go out of my way to put myself out there.
Mm-hmm. You generally go out of your way to keep from doing it?
Yeah, 100%.
But so I've known you now for 6 or 8 months, and I would argue that you're actually better at it than you realize. And I think that fits with what we're talking about a little bit. Our Midwestern roots kind of teach us to be self-effacing and assume that we can't do these things, maybe. But in reality, by being vulnerable and true to who we are, it actually comes across as more confident and more genuine. And I think that's something I've enjoyed about working with you and People's Company, that there's a lot of genuity, like a lot of vulnerability to people. You were talking about on our trip over here about noticing pretty quickly that somebody doesn't fit in at People's Company, and that you were able to pick up on that really quickly, which I think maybe ties into this, that you know what you want to be around. Before I dig into that, could you tell me, because I'm still learning about how People's Company works, what got you into this at the start? What trips your trigger about selling farmland?
Yeah, I mean, as I'd mentioned, I grew up on a farm south of Des Moines, and my dad and brother farmed together. My folks were Pioneer seed corn dealers. My grandpa ran the Ford New Holland dealership, and I've talked about this quite a bit, but my folks like buying farm machinery just like a lot of farmers do, and I was always getting the sale bills in the mail from the local real estate companies with farms for sale, and I was always trying to inspire my parents to buy some more farms.
Oh, really? Even as a kid?
Yeah.
Does that mean you were thinking aspirationally from a young age?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Yeah, I grew up during the '80s farm crisis, and it was a tough environment, but you wanted to dream about owning more farmland, right? And so I was always trying to encourage that. Of course, I didn't understand the financial constraints that I was, and maybe the pressure that I was putting on my parents to do it. It wasn't realistic, perhaps, but no, that's where I kind of got the liking for farmland growing up, and always just liked the idea of farmland ownership and having a vision for properties and what you could do with them, and so. I wasn't a great student. Unlike you, wasn't a great athlete either. So we grew up in, both of us grew up in small towns, and I didn't have a great academic outlook, nor a great athletic outlook. So the thing that I had going for me is that I understood agriculture and understood farmland, and was willing to work hard. And so I went to college, went to community college for 2 years, and then went to the University of Northern Iowa, where a bunch of my buddies that I grew up with were actually majoring in real estate. And that was pretty intriguing to me to think about the idea of getting a real estate degree. And I started looking at it and concluded that was going to be tougher than I wanted to be challenged academically. And I was coming home and farming with my parents. So I got a marketing degree and then got my real estate license while I was in college. And so that was kind of how I got into it. And I'm giving you way more than you asked for here, but my real estate professor's neighbor actually had just bought People's Company the year before I was graduating from college.
Oh, okay.
So Dr. Art Cox was my real estate professor. So I took a couple of real estate classes, but I didn't get the degree. And so a small world deal. So my parents were farming farms that People's Company managed. My real estate professor's neighbor is now the owner with a couple other entrepreneurs. And so I got in the real estate right out of college.
So let's talk about intelligence. You mentioned, and you were being self-effacing right there about like, hey, I wasn't an academic guy, etc. But you have a zillion points of emotional intelligence, I would argue, just from the outside, that you're able to suss out. I mentioned you're able to see, do I want that person around me? Do I not want that person around me? You're able to make the connection with the professor's friend who had just bought People's Company. So if you cast off your upbringing and need to be humble, what is that trait like in you, that ability to see what you need out of people emotionally? How does that feel?
Yeah, what's odd about it is that it's kind of intuitive, and you just assume everybody else has it, right? And sometimes that's a bad assumption. And I'm fortunate that I grew up in a family that was in business, right? My parents were selling seed corn, and my grandpa was selling farm equipment, and so you kind of grew up around, customer service and recognizing, do we think this person's legitimate, or do you think this person's actually going to pay us if we let them take this seed without paying today? And so, when you grow up in that environment where you just have to, just intuitive to have emotional intelligence, I guess is what you would say. And so it's not necessarily something you're born with, I don't think. I think it's just what you grow up around and what your life experiences give you, I guess.
Do you see, as you are, so a lot of your business, right, is managing a whole bunch of brokers. So all these guys are out there. I mean, managing is maybe the wrong word, but you've got them kind of under your umbrella. So you're seeing people who are generally good at sales. And I think you would agree, and I've seen this, that most of that's relationship building, especially in your business, because it's not like selling a car where it's a one-time thing. Car sales, you could make, long-time customers. But in your case, these deals will build over a really long period of time because you're waiting to see if that person's going to have the 1,000 acres to even move, right? So do you see common themes in the people who work for you around emotional intelligence that seem similar to you or familiar, or do you see that their parents had a similar upbringing? Is there some consistency there?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that we talk about is if you're going to be successful in this business, you have to have that long-term approach. And anybody who comes in and is telling you, hey, because I tell everybody that joins the firm, you're going to starve the first year, you're going to starve a little less the second year, and then by the third year, you're going to be able to start paying your bills, right? Mm-hmm. And people are always like, wow, that's not me. I'm special. I work hard. And it's all right. I've watched this for a long time. And, I think people that come in with that mentality that I'm going to make it happen, I'm going to make it rain right out of the gate, they come in with a short-term mentality. And the people that come into this with this idea that I want to build something, I want to build a business that's sustainable, they put a whole different approach into how they tackle their relationships and how they tackle setting their business up. And it's those are the people, and you can identify it. You sit down and, people will, sometimes say to me, well, what's People's Company going to do for me? Or what resources are you going to put in to help me be successful? And it's we're looking for the people that are coming to us saying, hey, I'm in this for the long haul. I'm committed to doing this right. I've been watching what People's Company is doing, and I think it's a great complement to my skill set. I'd like to leverage the People's Company platform to build my business, right? And they're two different mindsets. Mm-hmm. And so I can usually tell in the first couple minutes which mindset somebody has. And,
as you learn about those people, do you see anything with their parents, for example, the way they were raised that feels continuous?
Yeah, usually there's some sort of entrepreneurialism in the family somewhere, right? So they just grew up and they, like I said, they intuitively were raised around understanding a good deal from a bad deal, a good person from a bad person, hard work and that sort of thing. So there's usually some hint of that, whether it's a grandparent or, a sibling or whatever it may be.
Which also tracks with what I found to be true in professional sports, which is that from the outside, people think a professional athlete is just really good at their sport, right? What they don't realize is there's a lot of people who are good at it, and that the coaches are deciding along the way, like, who am I actually going to put into the game? Who will show up on time? I remember a coach when I was a kid at Washburn's basketball camp, this coach named Bob Chipman said, the best thing I can teach you is to make eye contact with me while I'm coaching you, because I'm going to pick the kids who will make eye contact with me and are nodding to put into the game. And you can't score a point unless you're in the game, right? So you need to first get in the game. And to do that, you need to then make eye contact with me. And it was interesting how my perception of sports changed over time, because like you're saying, there was a lot more emotional intelligence required. There was a lot more just show up on time, do what you said you were going to do, than people want there to be. And that's actually that's been one of the challenges of my life in general, has been explaining that to people. And I think,
well, that's what you and I bonded over,
right?
Right. Talking about how, because any of my buddies that are watching this are like, all right, Steve's talking to Paul, Shirley, a professional basketball player, like like an odd couple relationship here a little bit.
Right.
But when we started getting into some of these conversations around emotional intelligence and, what it takes to be a professional athlete and showing up and being humble and working hard and building relationships, I mean, it's all the same stuff. And that's when it got kind of fun to go deep on some of this.
Yeah. Like I think we've talked about that book, Good to Great. That idea that even in that book, so for people who aren't aware, Jim Collins and his team study 7 sets of companies, one that did this and one that did okay, right? So like a comparison would be, I think it was like CVS versus Rite Aid or something. So what was the commonality of the ones that went like this? And actually, interestingly, one of the points was that CEOs of successful companies were not like the high personality types. Usually it was often more kind of quiet, understated types who were willing to kind of distribute the ball, if we're going to borrow from a basketball analogy. And I thought that was interesting because I saw that a lot in sports. People love to gravitate to the Magic Johnson personality of like, he's gregarious and he was a great leader, but there were a lot more guys who just showed up day after day after day and led through example, and that actually translated better to sustained success like we're talking about. The point that is made in Good to Great is the Lee Iacocca model of like personality-driven cult of personality leader usually ends up with the company tanking when that person leaves because there's no way to replace that personality. However, these other people who are able to kind of sit back and Steve Nash it to continue to belabor the point are able to like build a more longitudinal company than the ones that depend entirely on the Magic Johnson. Does that make sense?
Makes complete sense. Yeah.
Do you see that because you're in contact now with a ton of business leaders and CEOs, have you seen examples of people who are much quieter than you would expect?
Yeah, that's actually one of the cool things. I'll say that because of my job, I get to drive around in trucks with people I don't deserve to be in their truck, right? And look at farms with entrepreneurs, and once they've achieved all else in life, a lot of people like to invest in farmland, right? And so you get to know people, especially at a point where maybe they've exited their business or they've delegated a big portion of the work and they can actually get out and relax and look at farms. And so you get to know them in a way that maybe most people didn't get to know them, even maybe some of their own family members in some cases. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely examples of the very confident folks, and then there's the examples of those underscored personalities that I get to see both sides of it. And I think both work. I don't think there's right or wrong. I think it's just what fits your personality. But I think there's a whole heck of a lot more people that are more humble in nature. And I think that's probably what you experience playing professional sports, is that more people relate to that, right? Mm-hmm. And so you become relatable to your employees.
Totally. And the flip side of that is I think it's easier to imitate the big personality. And so people think that would be a shortcut. So understated, like there's 3 paths. One is understated, true to yourself. Overstated, true to yourself. Understated, but you think you should be overstated, which is the worst kind, right? But that's actually, people think they're under the perception that like, that's how I should be. So it's, interestingly, there's more people trying to be overstated instead of, there's not a lot of overstated people who are like, I'll just be humble.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it is, like you said, it's the authenticity of you can't be anything other than you are. A coach of mine at Iowa State, Larry Eustace, would talk about how the only way he could coach, the only way anybody can be a really great coach is if they're entirely themselves, if they inhabit their personality fully, and then they hope that that is successful. But you can't try to be somebody else and hope that will be successful. That just never works.
Not for long periods. Right.
Yeah.
Maybe a meeting.
Yeah. It'll work for a little bit, and you might be able to fool some people. But I think for those of us with pretty honed emotional intelligence, you can suss it out pretty quickly. Now, the thing I go through is my own humility gets in my way, and I sometimes don't trust my instincts because I'll be like, I don't like this person, but everybody else seems to, so maybe there's something wrong with me. How have you dealt with trusting your instincts in now doing this for 20 years?
Yeah, I involve a lot of people in the decision making, and so even when you came on board and started helping us out with some things, like I had you meet with half dozen people, and I'm like, I have this intuition that Paul could be helpful and useful in our business, and I felt really strongly about it, but I also knew that we needed buy-in from everybody else in the organization if we were going to have you help us out. And
they were all like, "This guy sucks."
Well, I trust me. I think there was a couple people that are like, "All right, Steve, what are you doing here?" Because I've been known to come up with some crazy ideas.
We'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah.
Talk rabbits, but go ahead.
Yeah. So I think people naturally in the organization want to help me avoid making bad mistakes, and so sometimes I don't like what people tell me when I have an idea, and they're like, "I think that idea sucks," and it's like, well, I actually wanted you to endorse it, but tell me why you think it sucks. And so I definitely, like, we really don't ever hire anybody based on my own instincts. Like it's like, there's usually 4 or 5 rounds of vetting with other people in the organization. And so, there's been people I love that everybody else meets like, nope, I don't love them as much as you do. And it's like, all right, well, if that's the case, then we'll move on. And then there's been times where I'm like, I thought this guy wasn't coming across real great, and I'm not a real big fan. But then people, of course, corrected me and said, no, I've been watching this person for years. I know their cousin. They have high things to say about him, and then so I've been wrong both ways. So I think just having, again, that humility to ask other people to be involved in the decision making, and then follow their advice. But also, when deep down you're right, and you want to go for it, then own that decision as well.
So that brings up a good point. Something that I think I've expressed to you, maybe after some wine, but would always want to double back on this, which is I appreciate your sort of core belief in yourself and your core belief in doing things differently. And let me explain briefly what I mean by that. My life has been weird, like just no two ways about it, right? I grew up in a town of 700 people, went to college technically on an academic scholarship, played basketball, was good enough to be good, but not good enough to get drafted, had to kind of earn my way into the professional ranks, sort of hung on in weird ways, started writing about it, wrote a couple of books, started a space in LA for writers. Now I run a space in Denver for general workers. I do work with you guys. I do some individual work. And that has been really lonely a lot of the time because I've had these core beliefs around like, I think I can do this, but I'm getting a lot of feedback that I might be insane. However, it usually worked out, right? There has been some evidence that like my ideas, not ideas in terms of like, I'm going to invent a new steam engine, but ideas around like, I think that even though I'm from this tiny town, that I will get to play college basketball. And I think that even though right now I'm not that successful in college basketball, I will get to play professionally. So how have you maintained that inner fire, which I totally respect, and I think that's part of why we have bonded, is that ability to stick to your guns, right, in spite of feedback that's telling you otherwise.
Yeah, you just kind of hit something as you're going through that. Like, I think part of it is, and see if this resonates with you, like once you've made a decision that I'm going to make this decision, I'm going to make it work, and I refuse to let the idea fail, I think that's a completely different thing than if somebody else tries to talk you into buying into their decision and then you don't necessarily believe it, then you're not going to fight to keep that idea from failing. So I think, once I kind of commit to something, maybe if it is a little bit like, maybe this is right, maybe it's wrong, but once you're in, like, I just refuse to let things fail until I've exhausted all options. And so I think part of that is just that willingness to hunker down and just keep working at it until you get it right. And so does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say then is I was reflecting on where that comes from, right? And I think for me, so much of it is my parents and building a stable environment when I was a kid in which we could feel challenged. My dad was not by any means easy on us, but there was a sense that, like, you can take chances and that it's okay to fail. I have a friend who talks about how people think the American dream is that you yourself will go from 0 to 10, where 10 is, just call it maximum power, wealth, whatever, right? But in reality, it's more that each generation can move a couple of rungs up the ladder. So like you come here and you land at Ellis Island and you're a 0, and then you get to a 2, and then your kids maybe go from a 2 to a 5. And I was thinking about this the other day, that I think my dad, who put himself through junior college and a PhD with the GI Bill, like went to join the Air Force, and my mother really set up this situation where their sons had a chance to try different things and feel like they could come back to a home base. Does that resonate with you? Did you feel like that helps?
Yeah, I'm trying to process it a little different. Just because we grew up, like the whole thing was just work all the time, and I think just maybe the agricultural background of, you plant the seed in the spring and you face all the adversity all year long, and then hopefully you reap something in the fall. But there's lots of different things that happen throughout the growing season that change how you approach it. The decision was made in the spring, and you can't undo that decision until the next growing season. And so maybe a little different way of arriving at the same thing that you're saying, but it's just that undying commitment to steward the vision of the year through until you get to the finish line. And sometimes that finish line is going to be just okay, and sometimes it's going to be phenomenal, and sometimes it's going to be a bad outcome, but you were committed to it, and so you see it through and you do your best. And I don't know if that.
Yeah, there's an interesting teaser in there, that idea of you made the decision in the spring, so you're going to have to carry it through. I will note that, like, growing up for us, we had cows and chickens, and so we saw this seasonality as well. It's not to the degree that you experienced it, but I would also say that there was this idea too of always working. So we were like, I can remember my friends would be like, well, on Saturdays I get up and I eat breakfast and I watch cartoons and then I lay around. I'm like, what's that like? Because at my house, it wasn't, I'm not going to make it out like it was a slave camp, but we got up, we had breakfast, and then we went out and worked in the yard or with the cows or the chickens, or we'd go mow something or pull stumps or build something with rocks, whatever it was. So I do think there was a sense of kind of continuous motion that helps, because then you can try things out and realize if it fails, it's not that big of a deal because you'll get to try something else again.
Yeah, action creates activity, right? And so when you're out doing things, that's where luck happens, right? And so things come out of that. So I think pretty similar mindset.
Yeah, that's something I think about now a lot, now that so it's been 12 years now of me working with the way people work. And it's easy for every generation to say the generation below us is soft, right? And so I'm not going to do that, but I do see that within the world, there is kind of a lack of perseverance, because I think people aren't exposed to, I would argue it's farming, military, sports are the best ways to breed this sense of like continuous action. And because we've kind of softened, I think, a lot of academic pursuits, people to get a degree, but it wasn't that hard to get that degree. So therefore, that's not the weeding out process that it might have been. I think we are suffering from people. It's not necessarily generational. I think it's just cultural. And maybe this is because it's been so long since World War II that people have forgotten like how hard things can get. Does that track in your world?
Did you read that book I gave you, The Lords of Easy Money?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
all the way through.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, there's some parallels to cheap capital.
Big fan of that Thomas Hoenig.
Yeah, Kansas City Fed president.
Kansas City guy, yeah.
So I think that, what's the old saying, easy times create lazy people or something, right? And so, these whole, poor me stories of growing up in small towns and on farms and working hard, growing up, I used to think about my buddies that were out, and this comes back to playing sports. Like, we didn't play baseball because, first of all, I had no talent, but second of all, we were growing sweet corn and working, and so my parents didn't encourage us to get involved athletically. Maybe I would have been,
they hid the flyer from you. They're
100%.
They won't. Not for you.
Yeah. So, clearly, I've got the DNA to be an excellent athlete. But no, I think, I think the whole thing around growing up in those environments where you're forced to work and forced to learn how the world works at a young age. When I started having kids, I have 4 kids. And, if I have a regret, it's that my kids actually do get to watch cartoons. And I grew up with the pumpkin patch and the sweet corn patch. And so I decided, I'm going to teach my kids how to work. And, when I got into real estate and started kind of building people's company, I was like, you know what, I'm going to work my ass off so that I don't have to do the things that I had to do growing up. Right. And then I started getting a little success with people's company. I'm like, hey, I want to teach my kids the same skill sets I had growing up because I want them to learn how to work hard. So we went and planted a pumpkin patch down at my parents' farm and, did the same thing I did as a kid. But what happened is I'd go down there on the weekends. And again, I'm in the peak of my career and I'm down at my parents' farm on the weekend picking pumpkins. And my kids are playing with grandma. And I'm like, this isn't working quite like I had it in my head. Right. I'm still working my ass off. I've been trying to avoid this. My kids are playing with grandma. And so, I think that generationally, like when you have that easy times, make lazy people mindset, I think the current, this is getting philosophical, but I think the current Fed policy, this goes back to the book, has allowed us to be kind of lazy people.
That's a good point because it took me a long time to understand this, that book, but also just conversations with people when I lived in Los Angeles around, because money was so cheap and because there were not returns to be found in other sort of traditional vehicles, we bred a kind of lottery ticket mentality. I actually, while we were waiting to get here today, I picked up a copy of the Wall Street Journal, and it was talking about companies are trying to do the same with fewer employees, right? And that actually speaks to what people felt was, I can start an app or a social media platform or whatever it might be with only 6 of us, but then it'll be worth $1 billion, as opposed to a traditional model of work, or company building, which is a much more linear path. Everybody was looking for this because they had to, because the money was so cheap that was the only way for it to pay off. Now, the thing I've been thinking about a lot is the connection that comes through hard work, and that we cannot avoid that. And I think you and I have bonded on this. We've talked a lot in the last 6 months, and you've tried to inculcate within the company this idea of not being apologetic. And some of that, I think, is saying to people, look, we're going to set you up to succeed, but we're going to work hard, and we're going to work hard together. Because I think that's, interestingly, we have created this mechanism for people, this kind of if-then statement of, if you work hard, then you get to rest. But that doesn't actually make people feel connection and meaning and purpose. What does is working together. You've probably heard me say this quote, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, but I think this quote matters. It's by this French flyer and author named Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and he says there's no greater comradeship than union in the same high effort. So people working together almost automatically creates meaning, whether it's you are working to build this podcast studio, whether you are on a minor league basketball team and you're like, God, we got to drive to Sioux Falls tonight and then we're going to have to play a game tomorrow, or you're building a land and real estate company. It all comes back to finding meaning, like turning back into, yeah, it sucks that the only way we can get that is through hard work, but that's just the way of the world.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Boone Pickens. So Boone Pickens spoke at the Land Investment Expo that we hosted, and then we started betting on, Iowa State, Oklahoma State football and basketball games. And I remember watching Boone Pickens delivered a speech once. It was valedictorian speech to his alma mater, and he goes on. He said, "Hey, I flew in on my G7 today. From my 67,000 acre Mesa Vista ranch, and was talking about his multi-million-dollar home in Dallas. And he said, I would trade all of that to be one of you, to be young, to fight the fight again. Right. And I think that's a little bit what you're talking about is just being in the trenches, fighting the fight with people. That's where you build character. That's where you build relationships. That's where you get those war stories that you talk about. And if you don't go through that, then you don't get that bonding.
Totally. How do you square that circle with guys who are maybe having a bunch of success and their eyes get big and they start to buy the bigger house or whatever it might be, whatever the trappings are of that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we love it when people buy big houses because then they have to work harder to pay for them. So it's like, bring it on. Yeah, I encourage that. One of the things that like I've watched over the years is when somebody jumps in, and I went through that first year you starve, second year you starve a little less. Kind of around that COVID time when cost of capital was effectively free and agriculture commodity prices were high, there was no friction on transactions. So buyers wanted to buy, sellers wanted to sell, everything was easy. And so people that came into the real estate business in that era, that's like, this is how it's always been. This is how it is. And then they built their lifestyle around that. And now the change in cost of capital is putting the squeeze on everybody. Everything has friction. Everything's harder. And I've been telling our people, like, hey, we're going to have to work twice as hard to make the same amount of money. I actually think that's exactly right. Like, I think right now, and like you walk into our office and there's like people just like you can just tell they're wore out right now because they want to make the same amount of money because they need to pay for that big house they bought. But they have to work twice as hard because transactions are harder and there's more friction and then there's less capital out there chasing deals. And so I think that these are the types of environments where you start to really kind of get people forced into the trenches, right? And so some of that team building camaraderie that comes from that, maybe they missed it, and now we're sorting out who wants it and who thrives for it and who's going to be successful with it. And I'm actually quite excited about it.
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you I was at a reunion for the Phoenix Suns, which I basically have to convince myself to go to because I don't really belong there because I played for half of a season and I mostly cheered and I think I averaged about 3 points a game in all garbage time. So there's a part of me that's like, is somebody going to find out that I'm not supposed to be here? But there was a sense there, and I remember this so vividly, that the NBA doesn't make for good stories because everybody has gotten to this really high level and it has gotten super antiseptic, right? There's not I mentioned offhand the bus ride to Sioux Falls. So I can remember playing in the minor leagues in the CBA and playing in Bismarck, North Dakota. We play a game, we get on a bus, we ride all night long to Sioux Falls, and we're going to get up and play another game the next day. Well, that sounds terrible, and it was terrible in the moment, but I will never forget that, right? Contrast that with getting on a team plane from Phoenix and just bopping around to Memphis and nobody's talking to each other. Everybody's got their own little posse and their own little kind of corporation. I cannot tell you any stories from that period other than I can't remember what my hotel room was because last night I was in Orlando and now I'm in Miami. But that's not a particularly character building story. So how do you yourself, because as the company grows, there will be the temptation for you to also insulate yourself from that. How do you resist that temptation? Because that's something I go through all the time. I'm like, God, I wish I could rest. Last night I got to the farmhouse where you guys have me stay, which is lovely. And there was a part of me that's like, I am exhausted. I just drove here. I was in Phoenix. Then I was in Kansas City before that. But, getting over here with you and Kyle and Dave, I was like, oh, I love these guys. This is what I want to be here for, even though I'm tired and even though that's what's happening in my brain. I think we're all tempted by comfort. So how do you resist that temptation yourself?
Yeah, part of the problem is, people think I like to work hard, which I do. But like I create problems for myself, right? It's like you create this, like I have to solve this problem, otherwise the outcome's terrible. And then that forces the work ethic on yourself. And so I think when you get complacent, you're like, yeah, I'm just comfortable at this current stage, then that's when the complacency shows up. So if you're always just driving forward and like pushing to the next level, then you kind of create that forcing function that forces you to work hard. So, working evenings and weekends probably not something that a lot of people think that's a smart idea to like force yourself to do it. But that's just how I do it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but
so a thing I've also been noodling on recently is this idea. There's an Oprah quote: "You can have it all, you just can't have it all at once." Right? You've seen me write about this a little bit. This idea that you can get a bunch out of your life, but it's not going to be the work-life balance that people mythologize of. I'm going to clock out at 5 p.m. and then I'm going to go home and cook a steak, and then I'm going to watch a show with my wife, and then I'm going to tuck my kids in. That's rare.
Yeah, it's not that methodical.
Right.
Yeah.
That in reality, and you guys are interesting because you have such seasonality to your work in that, there's auction season, there's planting season, whatever. I think people fall in love with that idea of perfect work-life balance day to day, when in reality, the only work-life balance that's possible is over the course of our lifetimes.
Yeah, I came up with this stupid analogy, which I want to. Are you an Oprah fan? Like, do you watch Oprah?
I don't. Is she still on TV?
I don't know, but I just got that in my head, and I didn't know if you really were.
No, that was just a quote I had seen, and I started spinning on that.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. But so I came up with this analogy of a car going down the road. You got 4 tires, and you got health, and you got friends, and you got work, and then you've got family. And at any given time, you can lean into one of those tires, right? And you can ride it hard, and the car's going to still keep going. And as long as that tire doesn't blow out, then everything's going to be just fine. But of course, you need to rotate the tires once in a while and that sort of thing, and put air in them. And so that's my stupid analogy. And so for me, I got into the business when I was 22 years old, and I recognized when I was young, that's the time to work hard. And I didn't have, a family at that time, or kids, I should say. So you could lean in on working hard. And, that was a time where you had a lot of friends that were, didn't have families either. So a lot of happy hours, a lot of drinks after work and that kind of thing. And then as life goes on, they start having kids, you have family. So now you start spending a little more time on the family side. You can't work quite as hard, perhaps at that point. And then now I'm in my 40s, and you start thinking about your health a little bit more. You ignored that largely through the 20s and 30s. And so I think, like that work-life balance is a constant struggle. I've never met anybody who's not lying to you that tells you that they've got it completely figured out, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned that the thought of friends. One of the things that I find frustrating about this somewhat antiseptic and robotic time we find ourselves in is that people have forgotten that your friends come through work, right? That in fact your romantic relationships may come through work, right? That we have tried to. I joke that we've tried to make everything autistic. So it's like, when I'm doing this, I'm only doing this. When I'm doing this, I'm only doing this, as opposed to understanding the totality of human existence, where you're going to make friends at work, and you're going to make friends through your family, and you're going to make friends potentially while you're trying to stay healthy. So understanding that these things all have a bunch of carryover and crossover is much more natural than what I see in the world, where people, I see this at my apartment gym in Denver. People go into the gym with their headphones on, and they're just training. And I'm coming in there, an ex-professional athlete, laughing at them on the inside, because I'm like, what are you training for? You're not going to go to the Olympics. Why not just hang out, take the headphones off? We can joke a little bit about that's going to make it more fun, and you're going to now kind of multitask and maybe make some friends along the way. So I actually think people are making it harder on themselves when it comes to this balance stuff, because they want to try to segment everything out.
Yeah, I can see that. There's also the counterpoint, that's your time to like not talk to anybody, right?
Right.
And so there's probably some of that too. But I was just thinking about that. I was flying over to this event in London, and the idea, I told my wife over the weekend, I'm like, that was the first time that it was an 8.5 hour flight where I didn't have to talk to anybody. Like I just sat there and zoned out, and that was really healthy.
So I touched a sore spot because you're like, could I have some time, Paul? No, I think you're right. It's just that what I see now is the people I'm talking about aren't talking to anybody ever. They're just going to their apartment to work. So they're like working from home, put their headphones on, and they're kind of scared of people. And then they spend more time scared of people because they're scared of people, right? Yeah. Because it becomes difficult. So I totally see what you're saying. Like I drove to Iowa yesterday, as you know, which was 9 hours from Denver to 9.5 from Denver to Des Moines. And part of me is like, why the hell did I do that to myself? But I love that time of just getting to listen to some podcasts. I listened to one of your podcasts with Adam Christ. I caught up on a couple of audiobooks. I had a couple of great phone calls. I zoned out for a while. I think there's a ton of value in that.
I don't have anything profound to add to that, but it makes sense to me. Yeah.
How will you manage in the coming 10 years hard decisions you have to make about who stays and who goes as you grow?
Yeah, I'm learning as we go on that, because I'm historically like the nice guy, right, that doesn't like to make hard decisions and have hard discussions. And what you realize is that does a lot of damage to the hardworking people that want to get ahead. When you tolerate average to mediocre folks in the organization, that brings down the high performers. And so if you're trying to build a special organization and a high performing organization, like you can say that you want to do that, but if your actions don't reflect that that's what you want to do, then you start to lose people. And so, we had, a lot of these kind of eat what you kill, animal spirits kind of thoughts that we talk about. And, our core values all kind of support that, and mission, vision, all that stuff that you do. But then you kind of start looking, it's like, do our actions around who we have working here support that? And that really took some real self-reflection of like, what, like we're all saying a lot of this stuff, but are we actually living it? And your culture is only real if you're actually living it. And so, over the last year and a half, we've actually been doing some cleanup work on that regard, and it's terrible. Like I'm terrible at it. This is back to trusting your gut. Like deep down, you kind of intuitively know, like, no, this person's part of the future. No, they're not. And so forcing yourself to make those decisions is something that if you're serious about what you're saying you're going to do, then you got to do it. And so that's where we're at. And I had, I won't say his name, but the CEO of a major company told me he became the CEO, be one of the largest. I can't even say anything, or people piece it together. But anyhow,
look, it was biotech. Yeah. He's headquartered in Delaware, and his last name is.
So he took over as CEO of this company at 34 years old. Same sort of thing. Had a bunch of friends around him. General counsel was a friend. CFO was a friend. And he said the hardest thing you're going to have when you start to build the organization is eventually the people that were closest to you, their role, you're going to outgrow that. And you're going to have to be prepared to make some hard decisions there. Or you're just going to have to accept the fact that if you don't make those hard decisions, then the organization's not going to go where you want it to go. And so he was kind of challenging me and asking me, like, are you prepared to do that? And
what did you say?
I'm still questioning if I'm prepared to do it, because it's not an easy thing to tell friends that, hey, this is where we were when you came in. This is where we're going. And I'm still trying to master that. I don't have it figured out, but I'm completely convinced that, you've heard me say we need to be unapologetic about making the decisions that we're making. And so, I'm committed to it, but I'm just not good at it yet, and practicing and getting better at it. But we're trying to build a really special organization. And so, in order to see that through, we're going to have to make some decisions that aren't comfortable.
I was, I told you that last night I got in late. I was kind of fighting it just because I also ate way too many sunflower seeds and had some.
Didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah,
I didn't know that was humanly possible.
Yeah, I know, right? Like I could tell my stomach was fighting it a little bit, and so I was in the farmhouse, which is great and lovely, but also kind of spooky. You got that weird cellar down there that has the hole that you can see through from the kitchen, which I don't love. We're gonna have to cover that up at some point. Anyway, I couldn't sleep, so I got up and I did what I often do when I can't sleep and I've got a million thoughts running around, which is just to start writing it all down, right? So I wrote out like, okay, here's what's bugging me, and here's why I can't seem to go to sleep right now. And then I looked back at a similar sleepless night journal from a year ago, where I had just gotten broken up with. Like it was the week after, I couldn't sleep. I was like, what the hell happened? I don't know how this relationship spun out on me. And I was thinking, as I was reading that, I was pretty broken up about it at the time. But she made the right move. I think she could tell that it wasn't quite right, not only for her, but also for me. And I almost wanted to text her and say like, hey, you did a good job. But then I was like, she's going to think I'm trying to get back together with her or something. Right. But as you were talking, I was thinking about how I have been done a great service by some breakups, some getting cut. Like my first job out of college was training camp with the Los Angeles Lakers. And I didn't really have much business being there, but I got to be there for 3 weeks with Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal, and then got cut and got sent on my way. I cried about it. It was sad, but it was the right thing for them to do. Of course, I wasn't good enough. I think there's a lot of value in the long term with that honesty and with those conversations, and that it's not to say ever, oh, somebody should be grateful that I fired them or that I broke up with them, but that emotional honesty almost always pays off in the long run.
Yeah, that resonated on so many levels. I mean, one, every time we've done it, like leading up to it, it's terrible. Mm-hmm. And then you have the meeting and you do it, and like a couple of days go by and you're like so thankful that you did it. And then inevitably, I'll have a half dozen people in the office say, hey, about time you made that decision. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, why didn't you encourage me to make it earlier? I didn't realize how bad this was, Right. So then you're mad about it. And then you kind of go through that stage of like, okay, like now you're mad at yourself you didn't make it earlier. Mm. And then inevitably you run into that person later who was mad at the time, and then they found themselves in a better position somewhere else where they're more successful and they're actually thankful. Mm-hmm. So very rarely have any of these ever been filled with animosity. Like more often than not, you're thankful, they're thankful. And then that comes back to like the confidence in doing it. Like the more I do of it, and I think there's a little bit of this going on in the office right now where it's like, Steve might be enjoying this. and it's like, I actually kind of am, because it's empowering to realize that you're actually doing them a favor, or you're doing yourself a favor, or you're doing everybody else in the office a favor. And so when you trust your gut on this, and that's back to trusting your gut, it's like, you know if this person's got the chops to do what you want them to do. And if they don't, then you should probably make that decision. We had somebody the other day resign that I was 50-50 on if I was happy or not about it. And I think I actually might have had this conversation with you. My new test was if somebody walked in the office and said, hey, I'm going to resign, would my initial instinct on the spot be talk them out of it or say, congratulations or whatever? And if my initial instinct isn't to talk them out of it, then I should probably just go ahead and do it right now. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so I got on the website and I just started looking at everybody that works for People's Company. I'm like, if this person told me they were going to resign, and it gets a little out of control. Sure. Going through that exercise. But the point being, like you'd fight for the people that you need to fight for. And if you're not going to fight for them, then why not have that conversation sooner rather than later? And
keeping in mind, so we talked about this idea of work-life balance being longitudinal through life. Also understanding that people can come in and out of your life. I think we tend to take this really harsh binary perspective on this person's either working for me or not working for me, or in my life or out of my life, forgetting that if we are emotionally honest and vulnerable with people, that then they will trust us should they ever want to boomerang back around, and maybe life lines back up in some ways.
Yeah.
That's not always possible, but I think it's more possible than people think.
Well, trust me, we've got several people that worked for us in the past that maybe thought we were too hard charging, had too high expectations, weren't living up to it, parted ways. And then inevitably, I've watched them bounce around to a couple other different jobs, and you get the sporadic Friday night text message, kind of like the old girlfriend thing, I assume. But like, hey, how's it going? Been watching what you're doing. And then, so far as to ask if we have any openings, right? So I do think that it's one of those you don't appreciate what you got till it's gone kind of things. And so it's kind of like, what we talked about growing up with hard work. You thought it was hard work, but you wouldn't have it any other way. Well, these people that maybe thought you were pushing a little too hard or, making them work a little harder than they wanted to, then they go work somewhere else. And it's like, well, these people are lazy or they're not hardworking or there's no vision there. And then they're drawn back in. And then maybe the second time around, they appreciate it more than they did the first time.
Yeah. And I think that hits me around my basketball career because I can look back at that career and revise history and think that I was always the most mature, eye contact making guy. But there were lots of times where I was an asshole, right? And that it took some maturation before I started to recognize, well, what is actually moving the needle here? Yes, I'm good at basketball, but sometimes what moves the needle is me going over to the equipment manager and telling him thank you and looking him in the eye. And that led to an assistant coach who was with that team noticed that I did that. And then that boomeranged back around. Actually, that reminds me of when I went to training camp with those Phoenix Suns that I mentioned. I was coming off having my kidney and spleen ruptured while playing for the Bulls. And I had basically flipped my entire worldview and was much more appreciative, understood that life was a lot more about trying to help other people, etc. So I made the Suns opening day roster after training camp. So I was a non-guaranteed invite, which means it's hard to make the team from that position. So it was the first time I had made an opening day roster. But then 2 days later, I got cut. And I wasn't as devastated as I had been in the past. And in fact, I was sad, but I wasn't just prone on my bed. I remember writing a note on the dry erase board to the team, like, hey guys, it's been so fun getting to know all of you. I'll be rooting for you wherever I am. And then, packed my bags, went home to Kansas City, took a job in Russia, of all places, played there for a month and hated it. Not because it was Russia, but because the team was super dysfunctional. Signed for another month where I basically strong-armed this Russian oligarch by not caring into paying me as much per day as I would have been making in the NBA. That was my deal. It was like, I will stay if you pay me per day what I would be making in the NBA. After 20 more days of that, I couldn't take it, and I was ready to quit basketball. I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I missed 7 Christmases in a row. I hate it here in Russia. I haven't had a girlfriend since college. I just can't do this. So I get on a plane, come home. I actually turned down $55,000 a month to stay for 5 months in Russia because they made an offer to me going to the airport. Like, will you stay for this? So I get home. My agent calls and says, hey, the Phoenix Suns are making a trade tomorrow, and they're sending away 3 guys. They're going to sign you for the last half of the season. And so I went to Phoenix and got to play on the best Phoenix Suns team in history, best team in the Western Conference, went to the Western Conference Finals. Again, I didn't play very much. I was just clapping. But when I got there, the assistant coach, a guy named Mark Ivoroni, showed me a picture he had taken on his digital camera. It was a picture of that thing I had written on the dry erase board. And he said, when I saw that, I knew you would be back someday.
Yeah, that's incredible. So that's a great story.
It's that sense that there's a time, there's this other dimension of time, right, that people forget, that we have these options of maturing and getting perspective and realizing, like, you know what, that was my time with Steve at People's Company. If this person worked for you 4 years ago, there was a spark there, and I want to go back to Steve and say, here's how I've improved and changed, and I'd like to, come back to you. I think people forget that that's an option.
Yeah, and it's part of, you mentioned maturity, but I remember when I was first getting in the real estate business, I had this kind of mentality that you either work for us or you're the enemy, and I want to kill you if you're the enemy kind of thing. And over time, I've recognized that was completely irrational and a bad thought process. And I was reading a book. There's an entrepreneur, Bill Knapp in Iowa, built Iowa Realty, one of the largest real estate brokerages in the country, based in Iowa, and incredibly successful. And I just remember reading that book and just hearing a lot of the names that were in the book that were now incredibly successful outside of that organization. And then that's when you realize that people who had a stop in your organization that maybe went on somewhere else and then turned into a big player in another organization somewhere else, then come back into your life and impact you in a way that you never thought was possible. And if you had that mentality that unless you work here, I'm going to kill you, that wouldn't play out quite how you want it to play out. So having that bigger picture vision, but that comes with maturity.
I've heard you guys mention a little bit that there are, of course, competing brands within your own world, and that you're like, we're kind of friends with them. Right. You don't need to necessarily say that about who those companies are, but I've noticed that, and that feels really mature to me too, because you start to recognize, and I see this even in the workspace I run, right? So we're different because we run these structured sessions, and I've now gotten to the place where when somebody comes in and they say, I don't know if I want that, I can be like, well, you should go over there. That place can do what you need, which is understanding that there's plenty to go around for all of us in business. I've also seen this in writing. Like, a lot of writers get really Gollum-like with their ideas, and they don't want to support each other. And you're like, guys, there's plenty of people reading. There's plenty of writers to go around. It's interesting how I think people's impression is that it should be hyper competitive, that it should be that idea of, if you don't work for us, you're the enemy. But in reality, as we mature into our 40s and 50s and 60s, we realize, I got plenty of work to do. I'd be glad to have you take some of it, right?
100%. So one of the things we talk about is abundance mentality, and there's no shortage of work to do. The only shortage there is time in the day to get it done. And so, we're always trying to encourage people to have this collaborative relationship, not only with people outside of our organization, but even internally in the organization, and just share information. And some of the best deals I've ever done are with competitors, where they're like, hey, this came across my desk. I can't work on it. Can you help me? It's beyond our skill set, or it's out of an area where we can't do it. And again, if you have that mentality where it's like, I want to kill you because you're a competitor, those deals would never happen.
Right. And I think what comes to mind there to me isn't basketball, but baseball for some reason, in that a lot of baseball trades, you think, they're trying to put one over on the other team. That's not really how that goes. It's more like, hey, that I'm interested in that guy, and I know that you're interested in this guy, and how can we both improve, as opposed to, I'm going to try to screw you, because then next time we're talking about this, you won't trust me, right?
100%. Like anybody, and this comes back to those instincts. There's a lot of people that are I win, you lose, and you only need to do one deal with those kind of people. So but if they're a win-win organization, it's like we can both win together, then those are the types of people you want to do business with.
Which, last little basketball anecdote, and then I want to ask you one last question. I found this to be really true in the NBA, especially, and overseas, actually, where the best run organizations are also the kindest, the hardest working people. And it was stunning to me how even at the highest levels of basketball, there could be so many poorly run organizations. And I think that's true in business too, where you'll get into the muck with somebody, you're like, I can't believe you guys are still in business.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how it becomes like a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of success begetting success, which I think is interesting, because I think people would think, I put that wrong. It's more about kindness begetting success. I think people think that it's the most cutthroat people who succeed. And in some cases that can be true, but a lot of times it comes back to kindness, honesty, trust, those kinds of things.
Yeah. How many poorly run organizations actually win the championship?
None.
I mean, I assume.
Truly. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it takes getting to well run, and then you might have a chance of winning, but poorly run is not going to ever work.
Yeah.
When I was with the Chicago Bulls, it was the Chicago Bulls of Tyson Chandler and Eddie Curry, and the bones of the organization were still good from the Jordan years.
Who was the coach when you were there?
Scott Skiles was the guy who's great. I loved him, but But you could tell that there'd been enough bleed over time where the organization was just a shambles of its former self. Whereas in Phoenix, Jerry Colangelo, who had bought that team in like the 70s, had not then sold it, but he had run it so well for 20 years where it was just a well-oiled machine. And so then he was in a position to succeed. It didn't guarantee success, but it at least gave them a chance.
Yeah. I mean, I assume all this stuff like culture and ownership and right coach, right players, all that stuff. It's the same as business. I mean, yeah.
And I think what is surprising sometimes about the business world is there are certain businesses that would just succeed in spite of the people because they found a niche that's so specific and it kind of doesn't matter what they do, right?
Yeah, inevitably though it does at some point.
Yeah, at some point, right? Yeah. Right. But I think there are certain things where if you can hone in on this one, this is all we do, and nobody else does it, you can get away with it for a while.
Yeah, we have some competitors that have, you're like it's like shocking that they keep going on, but over time that solves itself.
Right. Of course. What? Okay, if you look back and you're thinking about yourself at 22, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, I mean, life is, the whole thought around the long-term approach, I think is the right thinking. And ironically, again, this is actually honestly ironic because I'm not a sports guy again, but I always thought about my career as 4 quarters of basketball. Mm-hmm. And so, and I kind of picked when I wanted to retire a little bit in my head when I got into the business at 22. And so then you start thinking about, okay, I'm through the first quarter, I'm at halftime, I'm 3/4 of the way through. And then you start thinking about where am I at on the spectrum of success? And, the first quarter is just a grind. And the second quarter is still a grind. Mm-hmm. In the third quarter, you're starting to doubt yourself a little bit because you're like, I don't know if this is actually going at the pace that it needs to go at in order to get to the point that I want it to get to. And what I realized is that when you build the right foundation, they're like dog years. Mm-hmm. It's like a year in your 40s is like 7 years in your 20s, if that makes any sense at all.
Oh, totally.
And so like the pace and scale at which things start to happen once you get that momentum really picks up. And so I tried too hard in a lot of ways and tried to force things to happen at 22 that I don't have any regrets about any decisions that I've made other than to say I would probably have been less aggressive with some of the decisions and just trusted that long-term perspective and doing it the right way would pay off because there's so many people that don't return phone calls and respond to emails and don't do what they say they're going to do. And if you just do it right over a long period of time, like you're going to be successful. And I was trying to force my way into some situations that if I could go back and redo some of that, I'd maybe approach that a little more tactfully.
Yeah, that hits home for me in 2 ways. One is I look back at my basketball career in a similar way where when I was young, I was playing from a position of fear. Like I was kind of chased by this fear of failure at all times. And I did a lot of, in retrospect, really dumb stuff around playing hurt and not just like giving myself a chance to succeed. And the other thing was, you mentioned that idea of like dog years. I'm noticing that even in my career now, that things are starting to unfold in cool ways. Like even our relationship, right? So that wouldn't have been possible 2 years ago because I wasn't in a position really to know what the hell I was talking about with some of this stuff. That developed organically. I didn't drive to the People's headquarters in Clive, Iowa and say, hey, Steve, could I come do a little work with you and figure out how you guys work and stuff? And I obviously have a long way to go in that realm, but the last thing I'll say about that is you mentioned an abundance mentality. I think one of the struggles we're having societally is that people think they have to retire at 65 or 70. Whereas if you can take this abundant mentality of like, I don't know what the future holds, and I'm not sure. I may live to be 95, and if I do, like, why would I want to stop working? And don't I enjoy this? Why can't I make this into something that can last forever, as opposed to this, which maybe goes back to that idea of like cheap money, where people thought all the time they needed an exit, right? They were always like, well, I'm going to churn this up and in 10 years sell it, which again isn't realistic based on like long-term historical trends. If we can remind people like, no, you can ebb and flow, but there's a certain pace here where this can become sustaining and abundant over the fullness of your life.
Yeah, no, that's profound. You know, people will ask me a lot, like, when will you retire, or how much is enough, or this, you know, some of those deep thoughts questions, and I just love what I do, and you know, I get to travel around and look at farmland all over the world, and you know, I'd mentioned I was in London last week at a farmland conference, and the ability to do that and have fun and love it and enjoy it is something that you know, I was talking to my kids about, like, you know, career choices, like just pick something that you love to do, that you love to spend time on. And for me, I found that in farmland, and I'm grateful that I did. But, you know, there's also clients that you don't want to have, right? Mm-hmm. And this is maybe a tad inappropriate, but I've talked about, like, retirement for me is having FU money, right? Mm-hmm. Like the ability to say to a client, you know, I don't really need your business, because it goes back to that cultural fit. Like if they don't share your values and your vision, then, you know, when you're 22, it's like you're taking everybody on. Like, even if I don't like you, I need your business, and I'm going to go work hard. And that's, you know, kind of going back to the abundance mentality, just trusting that there's always going to be business there, and then finding those right clients with the right fit for you. I think it's a big thing. So I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah. Well, what came to me, there's a quote about writing that is to say that writing a rough draft is like driving at night with your headlights off. But I think business is actually really similar in the trust mentality of like, I don't know what's coming over the hill exactly, but I have to trust that it's going to come to me, that the road's going to rise up to meet my feet, or whatever that Irish proverb is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's deep, but that's exactly right. Like, you just have to have some confidence that if you do the right things, the right outcomes are around the corner.
Right, which if people are paying attention out there, we're going to come back to, you don't have to be that talented. Like you just said, it's just do what you say you're going to do. Return the email, return the phone call. That's basically it.
Thank God for that, right?
Yeah, right. That's what I always go through. Honestly, I mean, you were being really humble earlier, and I appreciate that. And I'm not being falsely modest when I say I thought adulthood was going to be way harder, because I thought you had to be like gifted. It turns out that, like we're saying, if you just show up on time and look people in the eye, it puts you ahead of a huge portion of the population, which I think is great news.
Yeah, no, it is. It's I think it puts you ahead of like 70% of the population.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for sitting down and chatting.
This was fun.
Yeah, we should just do it in a year and be like, okay, where are we? We'll take back everything we said. That was all insane. Like, that was wrong.
I'm all in on that.
Yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it as a yearly update. Are you losing your mind yet, Steve? Because I'm losing my mind. That'll be us in a year.
We might have to have a therapist.
Yeah, that's actually good. We'll put somebody
in the third chair here.
Couples therapy.
Yeah, there you go.
Steve and Paul hate each other now. Yeah. How are we going to unpack this?
That's amazing.
Well, I will say, just from a point of gratitude, that I will reiterate that last night, you know, laying there awake, I was like, what am I doing? But I love getting the chance to work with you and People's Company, and I think our meeting was well timed, and I'm glad to be a part of your life.
Yeah, no, it's inspiring, and like anytime you can have somebody that you are equally inspired by in your life, then that's pretty powerful.